Hello and good morning, everyone. I'm Helen Miller, Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this morning's event on support for children with health needs. I think it's fair to say that there is growing awareness about and concern about England's system of support for children with special educational needs and disabilities. It's a system that now has many more children in it. It's a system that now costs a lot more money. It's a system that is putting councils under financial pressure because they have a statutory obligation to provide support, but their funding is running below that. So they are racking up big debts. Lots of parents are very frustrated with the system. It's clearly a system in need of reform. And we're expecting the government to announce a white paper later this year. I think what's less well known is that there has also been a rapid rise in the number of children receiving child disability living allowance. That's a cash benefit that supports children with certain health needs. And it's one that's been basically unchanged for the past 30 years. So today we've released new work looking at both of those systems and how they interact, setting out who is receiving support, how that's been changing, what happens to those children as they enter early adulthood, and what are the challenges for reforming those two systems going forward. That work is part of our annual Green Budget, for which we are very grateful for the Nuffield Foundation for providing the funding that's made that possible. Today, I'm joined by the three colleagues here at IFS that have written that report by Edwin Latimer, Luke Sibieta and Darcy Snape. Darcy's going to kick off this morning presenting the highlights of that chapter for you. They'll all then be around for the Q&A. After Darcy's presented the chapter, you're going to hear from Ruth Patrick. Ruth is Professor in Social and Public Policy at the University of Glasgow. She has a large body of work looking at the lived experiences of poverty and social security receipt, and at the moment is leading the Changing Realities programme, which seeks to understand the changing pressures of living in a low income in the UK today. And importantly, she's recently produced a briefing on the experiences of families with children in the special educational needs and disability system. So it's perfectly placed to talk about this, and she'll provide her thoughts. So we're very grateful for Ruth for doing that. After that, we'll come back for a Q&A. I'll pop up. There is a Slido link, so please pop your questions into Slido and vote for the ones that you would most like to see the answers to. But for now, let me hand you to Darcy.
Thank you very much, Helen. So we're going to be looking at support for children with special educational needs and disabilities across the education and the benefit system. Now, as Helen mentioned, we've seen a rapid rise in numbers across these systems. In fact, we've seen numbers in both systems roughly double over the past decade. And as a result, this is an area where government is actively considering reform at the moment, particularly in the education system. So before we dive into some of those trends, I'm just going to give a brief overview of the support available for children across both systems. So starting with education, a child can be identified as having a special educational need or disability if they have a learning difficulty or disability that requires extra educational support. About 1 in 5 children have some form of identified special educational need. But within this system, there's essentially 2 tiers of support. So the lower tier of support, which is meant to cover most children with special needs, is called SEND support. This is relatively low cost and non-specialist, provided within the school's core offer, and is meant to cover most children. Obviously, there are then going to be some children with much more complex and typically high cost needs. These children can apply to receive what's called an Education, Health and Care Plan, or EHCP. That's the first of our 2 key acronyms today. And this sets out the specific support that a child is legally entitled to receive. Most of the funding for this comes from councils to kind of top up what schools are required to provide. In the benefit system, the main benefit available to children with health needs is Child Disability Living Allowance, or CDLA. This provides cash to families who have children with mobility difficulties or additional care needs, and this is intended to cover some of the costs that those additional needs bring. So this is not means tested. The amount ranges depending on the severity of need in question, but on average, families receive about £5,500 a year. And this was introduced in 1992, and since then has seen pretty much no change to the structure of the benefit. So now we're going to look at some of the trends in numbers of children receiving this support. And I'll start again with the education system. So this is focusing on that highest tier of support, EHCPs, and historically we saw the share of pupils with an EHCP hover around 3%. Now that has changed very dramatically since roughly 2018, and now over 5% of pupils have these EHCPs. We've seen pretty similar trends in the benefit system. So the share of children claiming CDLA has risen from roughly 3% to nearly 8% today. And official forecasts by the OBR suggest that these numbers are going to increase and that we might expect roughly 10% of pupils in England, 10% of children in England to receive CDLA by 2030. Now, there's no official forecast for the numbers of EHCPs, but our projections suggest that based on current trends in increasing take-up, you might expect roughly 8% of pupils to have an EHCP by 2029. So these are very, very staggering rises. It's also worth noting that in a lot of cases, these pupils in these different lines are the same pupils. So nearly 80% of pupils with EHCPs have CDLA, roughly 50% of those with CDLA have EHCPs. So typically children are receiving both of these forms of support, and the underlying trends we're seeing are common to kind of one group of pupils. Now, with rising caseload comes rising spending. Spending on CDLA has increased from about 2 billion in 2016 to about 4 billion in England today. And OBR forecasts suggest that that's going to increase by a further 2 billion over the next 5 years. Spending on high needs, so that council spending that goes mostly towards pupils with EHCPs, has similarly increased very dramatically and is now at around £12 billion today, taking the combined cost of both of those forms of support to around £17 billion today. Now, to put that in a bit of context, the budget for the Ministry of Justice this year is roughly £14 billion, so this is kind of a very first order issue for the public finances. And indeed, there are no official forecasts for high need spending, but if it continues on a similar trend that we see, we might expect the combined cost of these two forms of support to reach over £21 billion by 2029. So again, really staggering rises. Now, we can break down this rise in numbers by the type of need that pupils are receiving support for. So this is looking at the number of pupils with the EHCPs. And what's really interesting is that across a lot of forms of need, we've seen very little change in the numbers receiving support. So you can see numbers for learning difficulties, for example, have remained almost unchanged over the last decade. For some other forms of support, such as language and communication needs or social, emotional, mental health needs, that includes ADHD there, we've seen a bigger rise since, again, around 2018. But overwhelmingly, the largest rise that we've seen is in pupils claiming support for autistic spectrum disorder. That's something we also see in the CDLA system. So the categories here are much more out of date, but most of the rise has been concentrated in what's termed learning difficulties or behavioral disorders. And when we look at other sources of data, it generally seems that most of that is made up by pupils with autism or ADHD. And it's worth noting here that this rise in autism diagnoses in particular is a trend that we're seeing across a lot of countries. It's certainly not unique to England. We've seen similar trends in the US, in Scotland, in Australia, in Japan, for instance. These are really global trends that are occurring in England as well and manifesting in the systems in this way. So now we're going to turn to the demographic differences between pupils who receive support and those who don't. And it turns out that those who receive support in childhood look very different across a range of characteristics. So first off, what I'm showing you here, in green, we've got the share of pupils with receiving CDLA, and in yellow, we've got the share receiving EHCPs. And what's very clear is that boys are far more likely than girls to receive support in childhood. Over 2/3 of those who receive either form of support are male. This has remained very stable over time. It's roughly in line with underlying estimates of prevalence for autism or ADHD, for example, although there's a lot of uncertainty about whether there's underdiagnosis or underrecognition in girls. We also see that children receiving support tend to be from much more deprived backgrounds. So showing you a similar thing here, and this is and clearly those who are eligible for free school meals, so this is a more deprived group of pupils, are far more likely to receive support. We see similar trends when we're looking at, for instance, neighbourhood levels of deprivation. Pupils who grow up in poorer neighbourhoods are far more likely to receive support than those who grow up in more affluent neighbourhoods. And interestingly, despite this kind of real rapid rise in numbers over the last decade, this relationship has remained very stable over time. And finally, we also see really large differences between ethnic groups in who receives support. Now, part of this will be due to those patterns of deprivation that I was just talking about. But even if we just look at a subset of pupils from relatively deprived backgrounds, so this is here on the right, pupils who are eligible for free school meals, we see that these gaps persist, and consistently, Asian pupils are less likely to receive support than Black pupils, who are less likely to receive support than their white British counterparts. There's not a lot of evidence as to why these gaps persist, but it could be due to differences in awareness of need or recognition of need in certain groups. We're now going to look at the outcomes of children who receive this support. So we're going to stick with school for the moment, and this is showing you standardized GCSE scores for pupils who have no SEND support and those who have EHCPs. And what's immediately obvious from this is that there are really large gaps in academic attainment between those who don't receive SEND support and those who have this kind of highest form of SEND support. Now, to some extent, this might be unsurprising. A lot of children who receive EHCPs are going to have learning difficulties, for example, that directly impact academic attainment. But what's very striking is that this gap is so large and that it has been very persistent over time. So we've seen perhaps a slight narrowing of this gap around 2017, and this might be due to different compositions of need receiving EHCPs. So here I'm showing you that breakdown by those different types of primary need, and we can see that, for instance, pupils with autism tend to do slightly better on average than other pupils with EHCPs. But in general, attainment of pupils with these different needs has remained very stable over time, despite this real change in the number receiving support. Fast forwarding slightly to young adulthood, there's a range of outcomes we can look at here. In the green bar, I'm showing you children who received both EHCPs and CDLA at age 15. So this is perhaps the kind of group with the most severe needs. And in the yellow, it's all other pupils. And this is the share of those who were on adult disability benefits at age 22. And those who received both forms of support in childhood are over 20 times more likely to receive adult disability benefits. Again, in a lot of respects, this might be unsurprising. A lot of the health needs that children have will persist into young adulthood. But what's important to take away from this is that given we've seen such a large rise in the number of children claiming support, if this pass-through to adult disability benefits remains relatively similar, we might be expecting to see a real rise in the number of young adults claiming adult disability benefits over the next few years. And that has obvious longer-term implications for the public finances. We can also look at a range of other outcomes. So this is showing you that those who received both forms of support in childhood are about 3 times more likely to not be in work at age 22. They're about 4 times more likely to claim out-of-work benefits. And about half of them were not in education, employment, or training at age 22. Again, the fact that these gaps exist is perhaps slightly predictable. Some of these health needs will prevent children from being able to work in adulthood, for example. But the scale of this gap is really very large, and in a context where the government has set out plans to increase uptake of education in young adulthood or increase rates of employment, this might really be a group of children that the government might want to target, given that these gaps in outcomes are so extreme. And what's also really important to note is we don't know how this support that children are receiving in childhood impacts these gaps. There's a real lack of evidence as to how EHCPs or CDLA impacts this long-term outcomes of pupils. And clearly, if in a space where we are thinking about reforming some of these, evidence on that is really important. I'm going to turn back to disability benefits for a second, and I think it's really informative to look at how the age distribution of disability benefit take-up has changed over time. So what I'm showing you here is that at each age, the share of people who were receiving disability benefits, this is just for 2019. You can see the age profile of this shows that children are more likely to receive disability benefits. This then tails off in young adulthood before rising again in kind of older working age population. Now, this is showing you how things look in 2024, and there's a few things to take away from this. Firstly, the rise in take-up of adult disability benefits has been very high across the age distribution, and we've just seen a shift upwards in take-up. But what's also important to note is that despite adult disability benefits getting a lot of attention at the moment due to increased take-up, actually it's among children where we've seen some of the fastest rises. If we're also looking at that section of young adults, we can see that the percentage rise has been particularly steep for young adults. And again, if we're thinking about the long-term fiscal implications of this increase in children receiving support in childhood, one worry there would be that this means an increase in the children of today taking up adult disability benefits as the young adults of tomorrow, with real long-term implications there. So what are some things we can take away from this? First, there's been this huge change in the number of children receiving support for special educational needs and disabilities across different forms of support. And our projections suggest that if there are no reforms to either of these systems, the numbers and, as a result, the costs are almost certainly going to keep rising. Second, we've seen that there are these real demographic differences across groups, and as such, any change to the support provided is going to matter for inequalities between these groups because the number receiving support is so different. And finally, we've seen that outcomes for children who receive support are very different from their peers. They're far more likely to be out of work or education and be receiving benefits. Now, these outcomes might be something we really want to improve, both for the long-term kind of public finances aspect of this, but also because it's crucial that the support we're giving to children now sets them up for the best possible futures, especially given that more and more children are claiming support. But there's a real lack of evidence as to the short or long-term outcomes that this support produces. Now, finally, what are some things that we recommend should be done off the back of this analysis? So first and very concretely, high needs spending is not currently officially forecasted, despite it having seen such a large rise over the last few years. This has caused a lot of problems for councils as funding just hasn't kept up with the spending that they are legally mandated to spend. As a result, many have racked up large deficits, and there's a lot of uncertainty as to the trajectory of spending and deficits over the next 5 years. And so we think that the OBR forecasting this spending would provide much more clarity on this issue. Secondly, CDLA has remained pretty much unchanged since 1992. What hasn't remained unchanged is the nature of children who are receiving CDLA. We've seen a dramatic shift in the types of need that people are claiming CDLA for, as well as the numbers. There's a clear case for reviewing whether the eligibility, assessments, and rates of support that are provided are suitable for the children who are now claiming CDLA. And finally, and more broadly, given that the government is already considering sort of reforms to the SEND system with a white paper expected later this year, there's a clear case for a more holistic review of the support provided across different systems. We've seen, for instance, that children who receive special educational support also typically tend to receive support from the benefit system as well. If we're trying to understand the total package of support that children receive and how this is setting them up, there's a clear case for thinking about these systems in a joined-up way. Now, any trade-offs involved for options of reform are going to be very difficult. There are sort of no easy answers in this space. But given that the number of children claiming this support is rising so dramatically, it's absolutely vital that we ensure that the support children are receiving provides good value for money and is setting them up for the best possible outcomes now and in the future. So thank you very much. I'm going to hand now to Ruth.
Thank you, Darcy. And you guys have all done amazing at sticking to time. So now I'm going to do my best to carry on. So I'm going to share my screen, hopefully. There we go. And let's just see, Darcy, can you just confirm you can see it? So I know I can't see anyone
All
else.
good.
Brilliant. All right. So thanks very much for that, Darcy, and thanks to Helen and the wider team at IFS for inviting me to kind of speak. And I am going to kind of take that brief on in terms of sharing some kind of particular reflections from the work that I do on changing realities. And in order to do that, I will, of course, have to just very briefly kind of try and explain a little bit about what changing realities is. And it is also worth saying that kind of what I'm about to share and kind of speak to is really, really, in some ways, I mean, it's definitely complementary to a lot of what Darcy was saying, but it's also very, very different. So I think what we've heard from Darcy is kind of a really helpful overview of some of those trends and, you know, the potential implications. And I'm going to try and kind of dig us a bit deeper into some of the kind of lived experiences and the lived realities of the current system. And I really kind of wanted to start that, and it's kind of both difficult and important, I think, to kind of start that with kind of personal experiences and personal insight. And I think that's important for me to do and be upfront about, because I am, as well as an academic and a kind of paid worker, I'm an unpaid kind of carer and parent to 4 children, 3 of whom have additional needs. And interestingly, and for me, sort of challengingly, 3 are actually like neurodiverse. So in terms of their diagnoses, they have exactly the diagnoses that Darcy was talking about in terms of us seeing that rise. And the one that you can see on this picture is the one I just want to speak to briefly in terms of kind of contextualizing some of the information. But he is just 6 years old. And I just think it's really important when we're looking at some of these figures and kind of having these debates to remember and remind ourselves that there are children at the heart of this, and children that are very often being kind of failed by systems of support. So I could literally spend the 10 minutes or the next 40 minutes talking about that and talking about some of the failures. And I won't do that because of time and because I want to spend lots of time talking about changing realities as well. But my son, who is only 6, you know, has a diagnosis of autism and also a demand avoidance profile. And he started school in a mainstream school without that diagnosis and with no kind of expectation that he has special educational needs. But he has had a very rocky, difficult, and I would say kind of an experience of failure within the mainstream school system. He's experienced repeated like fixed term suspensions, and he's also experienced kind of processes of wider exclusion, which have kind of included a failure into kind of, well, actually holding him in kind of segregation, you know, when he becomes dysregulated, and the kind of impact that has for him. Also, and I think this is really important, and I'm sure it it does speak to kind of broader work that IFS has done. We have encountered what I would kind of describe as a provision desert, and that maps across education, health, and social care. And I think one of my kind of reflections in response to what Darcy has been sharing is, you know, those kind of intersecting challenges that, you know, when we look at that increase in need, we have to also think about, well, what's happening to people that are navigating the health systems, what's happening when they're trying to get support. And, you know, my experience is definitely that support just isn't there. It's interesting, and again, like very happy to speak to this in the discussion if it comes up, but when we look at that EHCP process and the discussion that's, you know, very widespread at the moment about the reform to that, you know, we have now got an EHCP, but actually, as it stands and as of today, I've had an EHCP that's been finalised, but which doesn't name a setting. So again, if helpful, we can speak to that, but what that means is that there's been a kind of statutory recognition that the support is required, but nothing is actually flowing from that, you know. And then also, and again, you know, very much in tune of what Darcy's saying about those trends, you know, my son does receive child disability living allowance, and he receives that at the mid-rate care and low rate for mobility. And I guess as well, and it's something I'm going to kind of speak to in the kind of response more broadly, it's really important to recognise that some of the failures that my son is experiencing right now could very much lead to longer term harms. And, you know, I'm hearing that both from kind of medical experts, but just from the wider evidence base, I think, in terms of some of the trauma. And so, you know, when we look at those kind of prospects, you know, particularly for beyond the compulsory educational years, that's why it's so important to kind of make reform and get it right. Okay, so just like a pivot now. So as well as being a parent to children with SEN, and sort of really the reason I've been asked to speak to you today is because I lead Changing Realities. And very, very briefly on that, just to say that Changing Realities is a participatory project, which is a collaboration between almost 200 parents who themselves run a low income, researchers at the University of Glasgow, and Child Poverty Action Group. And as Helen said, you know, we're working together to both document what life is really like, but also really, really importantly, to push for change. And I'd encourage anyone who's interested to kind of check out our website and find out more. So why you might ask, like, why are we interested in SEND, or why are we speaking about SEND? Why are we writing about SEND? And I think what's important here, and again, it does link to what Darcy shared in the report, is that, you know, because we're participatory, we respond to the issues that parents are themselves raising and can react to that. And actually the particular experience and the particular challenges of parenting and caring for children with SEN, it was coming out through our kind of qualitative evidence base, and parents were saying, you know, this is a problem, this is a challenge, and they wanted us to do more of that work. And I think as well, and again, sometimes I can't say more of this, but you know, what that evidence base really does demonstrate is that if we are going to reform systems of support, we need to look across multiple government departments. So it's not about looking at kind of, you know, the DWP or DFE in isolation. I'm not going to go into this in lots of detail because of time, but I just wanted to kind of situate all of this and some of the evidence that we have on the everyday kind of realities of navigating SEND systems of support. And so this is a parent called Helen, who's from the north and east of England, and she works. And she's talking in this kind of diary extract, or it's an extract from a speech she gave in a meeting with Bridget Phillipson, actually, around all the roles she has as a parent, but, around that arising from the additional needs. And then she also talks about, you know, what it's like and the challenge. She says, you know, if I have a traumatized, dysregulated child that won't attend school, then I'm no longer able to work. And what we see both in the evidence base, and it's kind of reflected in Darcy's figures, is that parents are often both pushed into poverty or like experience poverty as a result of SEND needs. So it's very common among our sample for parents to say, I was working, I was doing well, but then, you know, I had a child who was disabled and that had to stop. And again, there's a kind of role for broader systems of support here. Similarly, just I think when we're looking at reform, we have to recognise that there are kind of challenges around the current systems of support, and that these kind of cut across and intersect with poverty, but also intersect with other structures. So, for example, as Tayaba is speaking to here, the DWP and the kind of conditionality and sanctions regime, and the extent to which that doesn't support parents and carers very often, and those that are juggling additional needs. So some kind of quick responses from me in terms of kind of whether the kind of IFS's assessment of the status quo kind of matches with the changing realities evidence base. I think it's a really, really stark and helpful summary of the increased costs and needs for support. And I think kind of doing that across both EHCP spend and then disability benefits is really helpful. And I think this is probably like, I don't know, most or particularly important and valuable, that reminder of the link between kind of that receipt of SEND support as a child and then the risks of NEET status kind of growing into early adulthood. And as the report says, and as I would really agree very strongly, there's a risk sometimes that those policy debates happen in silos. So we have this discussion at the moment that's really live about, you know, what we're going to do with this rise in, you know, young people not entering work or education. And then we have this debate about the EHCP reform, and those discussions aren't happening together, and we're not joining them up. I guess in terms of kind of maybe more challenging kind of reactions, I guess I think it is hard, you know, to look at these trends kind of in isolation without a kind of maybe a broader exploration or a kind of contextualization around broader changes, cuts to schools funding, and also kind of, you know, around the availability of appropriate health provision and support. And I also think, and again, you know, happy to talk about this more in questions, that there is, you know, thinking about what we want to say and how we want to say it and how we want to frame it around this kind of rise in support for children, you know, who have ASD and ADHD, and what does that mean? And I think, you know, when we're talking about this, and we're, you know, you know, thinking carefully about language around, say, like talking about incentive framing, and you know, parents are navigating complex systems and sort of advocating for parents as best they can. I promised, or you know, I think I'm sort of running out of time, but I just want to say as well, in terms of the IFS's kind of summary of the options for reform, I've already said this, I think it's really good to see that kind of resurfacing of the importance of looking at the longer term costs of like inaction in terms of the educational and labour market outcomes for children with SEND. And I definitely agree, and I think most would, that there's a need for holistic review of support provided. And I can see the advantages in like some of the changes that they're proposing. I think I would, you know, advise like proceeding with caution perhaps just not doing it right now in terms of any review of child disability living allowance, just because of the broader insecurity that creates in families' lives, and you know, extreme financial insecurity and fear. And I think there's some very problematic implications that flow from that. And I guess just in terms of maybe some of the framing stuff, I think when we look at what needs to change, it's not just the cost of support, but it's also the fact that even that support, which is very costly, is failing people. And I guess also as well, and this is kind of like a framing point, that it's not necessarily inevitably bad that, you know, a rise in spend is a bad thing, especially if we kind of look at this from an investment model. So if we think about something like child disability living allowance, that is a benefit that is supposed to be provided to support with those additional costs that come with disability. So costs may be rising on that because there's more prevalence, there's more awareness, and actually we could think of that, you know, maybe not in a narrow economic frame, but as a good thing if we recognise that families need support with the cost of disability. And then more broadly, and I guess perhaps that recognition is there because I've sort of been invited to speak today, but I think a bit more recognition that, you know, who are the key stakeholders within a reform process and whose expertise do we incorporate, and just a plea, as I would always make, to include those with lived experience of navigating these systems. So just to kind of come towards the end and kind of you know, give a plug, I suppose, that on Changing Realities, we have been working very closely with government departments and with government ministers around trying to kind of make sure that these voices are included in these debates. And as part of that, as Helen said, we have published a short briefing paper about what we think should be in the schools white paper as it relates to support for SEND. And there's kind of 3 key principles to this. And these are firstly around, you know, listening to and learning from that direct expertise, you know, really thinking about that cross-departmental work. So it just isn't sufficient to, you know, to look at this in kind of departmental silos. We have to kind of look across on a kind of systems basis. And then, you know, trying to champion inclusion and diversity across the educational system. And I'll kind of, I don't know, barely say this, but I think very briefly, you know, we think that the ambition to make mainstream schools more inclusive is the right one, but, you know, we have to think about the timeline on that. So I think rightly and understandably, parents, like including myself, are very fearful of an approach that says, you know, we're going to take that legal statutory protection away, you know, before or, you know, without a really radical reform of the kind of SEND systems and that kind of inclusive thing. And I also think, you know, we just really need to kind of weigh up costs of reform and potentially further investment with the cost of inaction. And again, I think that IFS paper is really good here. This was just to kind of bring us back to my son. So this is like a picture he drew. It's kind of like a mess. He does lots of these, but, you know, I do think the current system and the current systems are kind of pretty chaotic and messy, but I also just want to say that me and all the parents out there, we do just want the best systems. So we want our children and young people to be able to thrive, and it's really remembering those children in these policy debates. And just to end, you know, Ella, who's a parent in Changing Realities, as she kind of, you know, she reflects on her experiences as a parent of a child with SEND, she says, you know, we owe it to our children who will one day prosper into young adults to not allow them to be the casualties of this nonsensical system. After all, it isn't their fault. They're born differently to their peers. So anyway, I'll close there, and I hope I didn't go over too much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much to Darcy and to Ruth. And I'd encourage everyone listening who's got an interest in this area both to look at the IFS paper, which is ram-packed full of great data, and to check out Ruth's programme. And thank you, Ruth, for sharing so generously your own experiences. Let's go to some questions. There's actually a lot of questions here that are basically a variant of the same question. So I'm going to start with that one, which boils down to why are we seeing increases in the number of children with diagnoses for autism or ADHD, kind of what's going on. So perhaps Luke, I'll ask you that first, and I can maybe bring in Ruth if she wants to add anything.
Sure, I'm happy to answer that. But I think the most important thing about this point is that we're seeing these increasing needs related to autism and ADHD recognised in lots and lots of countries. So it is absolutely not just a UK issue; it is a global thing. But there are lots of factors that are recognised as driving the increases in recognised needs. Some of it's increased recognition, awareness of needs that were already there. There's some research looking at changes in diagnostic thresholds, so pupils being diagnosed at lower levels that they might not have otherwise done before. There is some research on the role of environmental factors in driving increases in autism and ADHD. But ultimately, the research is kind of comes to different conclusions on the relative importance of those factors. So it's kind of mostly about greater recognition, but whether there is some also increased underlying needs is a bit more uncertain.
Great. Ruth, do you want to add anything to that?
I mean, I think just I would echo what Luke says, and I think as well, I would, if it's helpful, I think just return to that personal experience. So, I had a young child who started school at 4, and I didn't think or know that he was sort of different or not neurotypical, and it was only through an experience of him struggling so resoundingly that I saw and was given advice to kind of go through a diagnostic pathway. And I guess what I would say is that that increased recognition and awareness is a good thing, because I think in the past he would have been just written off as a bad boy. I mean, do you know what I mean? Because I think actually, and as Luke says, we're seeing this kind of rise in prevalence across different countries. So I think it is it's about an increased awareness, definitely in my experience. So, yeah.
Great. So I'm going to take the top question next, and another one which I think speaks to the kind of heart of this issue. So the top question says, why do we always talk of rising spend on disability as a risk to sustainability of the public finances that needs to be contained, but rising spending on the NHS is accepted as an inescapable feature of advanced societies? I think it speaks a bit to your point, Ruth. I mean, I think what I would say on that is actually we often talk about both of them as a risk in some sense. I mean, there are just lots of things in the public finances that are going up, and there's just a risk sense that if they all went up, we would have a problem. I think the real question that we should be asking, I think is the one that we're all moving around on, which relates to another question we've got here, is kind of how to reform the system, like what needs to happen. So maybe I'll come to Edwin. I mean, what do you think what kind of things are we going to see in the white paper, do we think?
Also, I think there's some questions about whether you can improve provision in mainstream schooling. I think part of the challenge here is that if provision in mainstream schooling isn't good enough, or parents feel it's not good enough, then it's clear that parents advocating for their children will look to get as much support as possible. And so that's something somewhere they're looking. I think the challenge is how to do that, and how to improving provision isn't something you can do overnight. So how you do that and manage existing needs is definitely a challenging issue.
Yeah, I mean, Ruth, you shared really generously your own situation and your lovely photo of your child. I mean, there's an issue here, right? There's a big, difficult, thorny issue for the government in that I think a lot of parents are unhappy with the current system. It's a big headache to go through it. It doesn't always produce the outcomes that are great for children. But at the same time, there's going to be a huge amount of understandable nervousness about any reform that might change. Having just navigated the system, no one wants to suddenly have it ripped out from underneath them. So, I mean, how does the government go about, on the one hand, everyone wants this system to change and be better for children. On the other hand, everyone's nervous about it changing. How do you navigate that?
Yeah. So thanks. I mean, I think I would just say, firstly, just on that broader question, like I do think, and probably it's me coming at it from a non-economic lens, which but I do think there is a case to be made that we can talk about social security as a force for good, and that there is spaces that they're not common, and there's not much of them, but there are spaces and arguments to be had around kind of reframing some of that spend as a positive investment. And I would be interested to know, and maybe we will see it with the forthcoming child poverty strategy, but if we do invest money in social security in our children and young people in our families now, that may well feed through to reduce costs. Well, we know other economists would argue that. So I guess I would say that over the past kind of 30, 40 years, we have seen this kind of real kind of problematization of social security spend in the round. And I think, there is an argument. I definitely would take a different position on the reforms. I think what we really, really, really need to see, and like I have seen some sort of positive signs on that from the DfE, is that we need them to work with parents, right? So we need them to, and also we need to think about the sequencing of it all. So and again, like partly drawing from the work of Changing Realities, but also my own experience, I think the direction of travel, so this kind of the ambition to make mainstream schools more inclusive, that is absolutely the right one. I would be much happier if I could send my son to a mainstream school that was inclusive. But I also think we need to recognise how far we are from that. Like, I just can't. I mean, again, I'm not going to, don't worry, Helen, but I could speak for like an hour and a half, more longer actually, about all the ways in which the mainstream school system is currently exclusionary and damaging, and actually, so I think then that what that then means is that there's a kind of parallel duty that we don't, as has been trailed in the media, we don't just strip away like statutory legal entitlements. I mean, definitely not first, or if at all, because it's so important. Parents who've been through those kind of battles and those challenges, they've done that out of desperation, and that statutory provision is so important for them. So if you need to kind of work and build a position of trust. So I definitely can see a future where the need for EHCPs is much lower, but you have to make those reforms to mainstream settings first, and and you have to be upfront about the scale. It's a big ask, it's a big challenge.
Luke, can I bring you in on that broader point about mainstream schools? So some of the questions here, I think some of the issues that Ruth raised in her response is about kind of funding for the broader school system. And there is a question here about where provision is best placed, but it's also the case that schools more broadly have challenges. So, I mean, to what extent are mainstream schools in a good position to be taking on greater responsibilities for this stuff?
So I think this is a really interesting question, and Ruth brought it up in her presentation as well, in terms of one of the features that may be driving increasing numbers of EHCPs is because schools don't feel able to provide core support that they're supposed to be providing through what Darcy referred to as SEND support, and that has been squeezed, and that means that parents and schools have to go down the EHCP quite reactive response route, because that is the only way to ensure that resources exist. And it's all the more interesting because you see it across so many public services, in that focus on really acute responsive public spending, as opposed to more coherent thinking about how you plan for spending that supports children and adults over the long time. You see a real big shift to acute spending within the NHS budget, when lots of people within the NHS would like to be spending more on community budgets, but never feel able to. You see it within children's social services budget, with huge amounts of spending on children's home, rather than even thinking, but everyone in the system knows you want to spend more on preventative measures. And you see it within the benefit system as well, because one of the concerns about the rising numbers of people on adult disability benefits and child disability benefits is because other benefits have been reduced. That means that people feel they have to go down other routes as well. So I think it's important to see things holistically and make sure we're thinking about the balance of the state between acute versus kind of preventative, more long-term thinking.
Yeah, so just related to that, I'm gonna come back to you, Luke, with another question, and maybe I'll go to Ruth. So I'm gonna just read the question out. It says, it seems clear from the analysis that the increase in spending hasn't been matched by an improvement in outcomes. So perhaps half the spend is wasted, but it isn't clear which half. And I think relating to what Darcy said earlier, actually, I'm not sure there is great evidence on the link between the kinds of supports we're giving to different kinds of children and what that does in later life. So actually, we don't know what the kind of return on that investment is. But it also seems when you speak to teachers that actually, for example, these pots of money that follow children make it also harder for schools to plan what's coming up next and to plan the provision. So to what extent do we know actually if there is some kind of wasteful spending in this system that could be better deployed, or actually is there still quite a lot to learn about how best to spend money on different kinds of children? So I'll ask Luke first and I'll bring in Ruth.
I think that the short answer is the evidence is very, very thin. And that's a problem, given the increasing recognition of need and an increase in spending. There's obviously lots of very, very good practice and great provision that goes on because of great leaders who are committed to providing for children with special educational needs, but also partly because of the budgetary situation, there is also a large amount of provision that happens because schools feel it's the only way of providing for example, one-to-one TA support with not necessarily the best training for providing for pupils with special educational needs. The amount of training for teachers in terms of helping and facilitating education for children with special educational needs is really, really poor. And it's often dependent on the head teacher and whether they're committed to providing good provision or not. So I think there's a lot of variation. And because of the way the system works, there isn't that much incentive or encouragement for schools to improve the quality of provision. As you said, it's very individualized. So if you were to say take a class with 5 pupils with special educational needs who have each have an EHCP, there's going to be a plan for each pupil. There's new resources to attach to each pupil in terms of maybe 16 hours a week with a TA or something similar. But there's no encouragement for the school to think about how those TAs can work together and improve their level of training to provide a really holistic approach that could provide for those 5 pupils, but also more widely across the school.
Yeah, remember, Ruth, what's your take? Do you think, do you see a system that's just sort of inefficiently using funds, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, I think, many of the points Luke made, like, I would broadly agree with. And I guess I would also say I thought it was really helpful in the IFS chapter where you sort of spoke about that lack of evidence. So actually, and again, it kind of links to this need for a more holistic look at it all, isn't it? So, if we were to think about 2 of the really big policy debates that we're going to see, loads of in the next 6 months, one is this: what does the government do about rising, inactivity among those leaving compulsory education? Then the other is the SEND white paper. But, we're not really seeing those 2 issues connect, are we? So I think trying to build like a bigger evidence base there is really, really important. And I guess I would also just say, and because I always have to, well, not have to, but I want to, that there is a real space for mixed method analysis there. So I think, the stats and the kind of quant analysis can get us so far, but we do need to kind of get below the surface, don't we, and speak to individual parents and families and find out, what works and what doesn't and in what circumstances. I guess on the kind of particulars of what is being provided and is it working, I think EHCPs can, as Luke says, they can be the gateway to real support, but also parents often talk, don't they, about there being a shortfall between what is kind of costed into or what is kind of recommended by the local authority and then what actually is received by the educational setting. And I definitely would really reinforce what Luke was saying and kind of argue for it, that, as parents, what is provided by what is sometimes called quality first teaching, so what is kind of provided without any of that kind of statutory provision, is often literally nothing. And then, so the kind of the cliff edge or the gap between, what could be provided without that kind of statutory entitlement to HCP, is too big. And it does then understandably and, push people, I think, towards that EHCP system, but, with very good reason.
So there's more questions here about the transition between CDLA and disability benefits. And obviously Darcy pointed out this, the children that have been on these benefits are more likely to be on adult disability benefits. Maybe I'll ask one of you guys. I mean, so the question is, how are young adults reassessed as they move from CDLA to adult disability benefits? Can I bring that to you, Darcy?
Yeah, so children who receive CDLA can transition onto the adult disability benefit PIP when they're about 16. They'll receive a letter and they'll be reassessed onto this. And as we saw, kind of most children who receive CDLA do go on to receive PIP, often at a higher award level as adults.
But there are some differences between the 2 systems, right? So not all children, I mean, they're not assessing exactly the same thing. So there'll be some children who've been on CDLA but don't get on PIP, and some children who weren't on CDLA who do get on PIP.
Yes,
yeah.
and as well as that, you're asked to apply, but some people don't apply. So you also have an issue where people who are on CDLA, have needs, don't even apply for PIP. So I think it's worth, one of the reasons why we were talking about this is time to review CDLA is there's also the TIMS review into adult disability benefits, PIP, happening at this time. And it seems that these 2 systems could be better coordinated. So if you're reviewing adult disability benefits, this is a good time to review child disability benefits at the same time.
Yeah, maybe obviously that Ruth, one of your challenges to us was maybe don't do that because of the challenges of parents. But it does seem that we've got this review of adult disability and all these things are linked, right? There's a whole system. I mean, there's also the government opportunities mission looking at, very, very young. There's a question here about, do we basically need to help children right at the very early age when they're preschool, trying to identify as soon as possible when a child has needs and giving better support to parents at that point in time before they even get into formal education. So there are all these things governments are doing from the early years through the school years, through child disability, adult disability, EHCPs. So of course, parents are going to hear that and think, On the other hand, we need a system that joins up and follows people and supports all at the right moments in time. I mean, I guess comes to you, Ruth. I mean, how do you trade off? You don't want to change the system because people are scared of changing the system for understandable reasons. On the other hand, you want the system functioning as a system.
Yeah, I mean, I again, like there's like long and shorter answers to that. But I mean, I think what I would say is that we could just look back at what did happen with the disability reforms that were proposed and what led us to the Timms review. And I think one of the things that we can't kind of quantify is the costs that are done to people's mental health by that experience of insecurity and fear. So what we had with those broader package disability cuts that were proposed is we had people that are already kind of often quite living like close to or at or below the poverty line. They were kind of thrown into kind of fear and uncertainty, worry that will have had we know like from the qualitative evidence base that will have had detrimental impacts. People's mental health may well have pushed people even further away from the labour market than they already were. And then when did we end up? We ended up with a mess, and now we have a Timms review that we're still waiting for kind of an outline of how that's going to look. So I guess my central argument would be reform for the past, at least for the past, I don't know, what, 2 decades now, reform has just been shorthand for cuts, right? So I think, and so I think the experience of those kind of in receipt of these kind of forms of support is that a reform is a kind of shorthand for taking support away or for reducing the budget. So it's not that I'm saying that it's not good to make systems better, but I think is that what we're really talking about? And if we're actually talking about trying to change and move around kind of eligibility requirements, I think we just have to be really, really careful. And I think overlaying like the PIP reform with the DLA reform with other stuff. And I guess the other thing I just say and a plug for another big project that I run, which is called Safety Nets, is we can learn from what's happening elsewhere in the UK here. So we don't talk very much within Westminster or within England about the extent to which kind of social security actually differs quite a lot depending on where in the UK you live. And actually, yes, in England we have PIP and we have child DLA, but in Scotland we have adult disability payments, we have child disability payments, and they have already reformed and taken a different approach, albeit within the kind of same budgetary kind of fiscal space. So if there is this discussion of reform, let's look first to maybe what's happened in Scotland. Has that been experienced more positively? Definitely, early evidence from our Safety Nets project, which is also funded by Nuffield Foundation, is that, perhaps it is. So let's learn from those. But I just think that we have to recognise the real risks of kind of embedding or entrenching further, financial insecurity and the impacts that has on people's mental health.
Thank you. The guys here were nodding along vigorously to the point about other parts of the UK. Did you want to say anything?
Yeah, I just wanted to come back on that partly because we did a nice detailed box of analysis in the report on it, which I think the comparison between England and Scotland is helpful for showing that there are underlying trends here. So we've seen increases in the number of children with autism diagnoses and reporting having autism increasing in both countries, but the way that support is provided is different across the 2 countries. So they've made different choices on disability benefits in Scotland. More children get disability benefits in Scotland since devolution than in England. But actually the equivalent of EHCPs, the most severe form of special educational needs, less children get that in Scotland because of a different design of the education system here. So it's clear that behind this trend, this like underlying trends in prevalence, there are policy choices about how you provide provision, and we need to learn what's the best way of doing that.
Probably we'll need to see over coming years and as we follow these children through the different systems. Let me take a couple of quick fire questions, then we'll come back to a bigger question. So quick fire questions. Do we know the number? My slide just moved around. Are we seeing that? Do we know this? Are we seeing the same growth pattern in disabled students' allowance? Do we know the answer to that question?
Not off the top of my head.
No, we'll have to look at that one and tell people later. Another question that's popping up in a few places, I'm going to ask you this, Luke. A few people writing in are basically asking about COVID, and there's variants on this question, but it's basically did COVID have a greater direct health impact on children, or did it disrupt educational outcomes in various ways? So, I mean, Luke, can I come to you on what do we know about COVID?
Well, clearly we don't have a counterfactual where there was no COVID pandemic, so it's almost impossible to answer properly. But the really interesting thing about the trends in special educational needs is that it looks like a smooth increase in numbers of children with EHCPs from around 2017, 2018. Whether that was exacerbated or increased by the pandemic, it's certainly possible, but there's no hard evidence to suggest that that has been a really key driver of the increases. And if anything, it may have just masked some identification that would have normally happened in 2020, 2021, and then there's been some catch up afterwards. So it's hard to argue it's been the key driving force, because it's happening everywhere and earlier as well.
Great. Edwin, I'm going to ask you this. So one of the things that Darcy flagged was the pressure on local governments here. So perhaps remind people why there's a pressure and kind of what's happening with the funding there.
Yes. So so for disability benefits, as demand goes up, the central government just covers that cost and it's demand-led spending. For EHCPs, the main pot of funding which is used to fund those EHCPs is called high needs funding, which goes through councils who are responsible for it, and each council get allocated a bit of that high needs budget. But obviously the number of children with EHCPs in councils varies based on how many children come forward asking for support and are assessed to have need support. And so basically you can end up with this mismatch where there's been this growth in demand, but fixed budgets. And basically what's happened is that councils have had greater off balance. Basically they've got that their spending has been bigger than the funding, and there's been this kind of basically hidden stockpile of off balance sheet debt, which some point we think that's around 8 billion, which some point the government needs to recognise and figure out what they're going to do with.
Yeah, and that's really important. Thinking about the broader reform of the system, it's important. Whatever you do to these particular systems, we should fund it properly and not shove it in some weird off-balance sheet thing, because that's clearly not sustainable. Okay, we're almost at time, so why don't we? So there's the basically a lot of the questions are really about kind of what to do next. So let me just come with give a few chances each, like a few seconds each, to think about what are we most hopeful about for the white paper. To what extent do we, should it be narrowly focused on, particular systems, or how does it think about the broader, all the other things that matter for children, sports in school and early provision and all that kind of stuff. So I'll come to you first, Luke, and then Ruth and others if you've got time. I mean, what should the government be thinking about for this white paper? What's the kind of big message, do you think?
Luke? Well, with regards to special educational needs in particular, I think the most important issue is around capacity on the supply side. So the best way to provide and increase the ability of schools to provide for children with special educational needs would be improving the training of teaching assistants, improving the training of teachers so that they can meet a wide variety of needs, which are now closer to high incidence rather than being quite specialised needs before. It's just should be part and parcel of what schools do because they are so high incidence now. So training is a key aspect of that. And as part of that, planning a workforce that can provide for those needs on a day-to-day basis. So I think there needs to be a focus on long-term supply side capacity.
Right. Ruth, I'll give you the final 30 seconds. What's your one key message to the policymakers listening to this?
Well, I think you've probably got to know me enough to know that I'm not good at ones, but yeah, I mean, I would agree, but but I would also just say, like, work with those who really know what the challenges are. And I think that central ambition to make mainstream schools more inclusive is the right one, but let's take that like by the horns and recognize it for the big job that it is. So.
Great. Well, let me wrap up there and say thank you to all four of our speakers today who've been wonderfully. Let me also say again that you should absolutely check out the IFS report, which these guys have worked super hard on, which is brilliant. Check out Ruth's programmes, which are doing great work. And I'll plug the podcast series that we made over summer, looking at the Opportunities Mission, which looked at everything from the early years right through to adulthood and all the bits of the system, including the bits we've talked about today, but the many others as well that are shaping children's lives in the UK. So do check out one of those other resources. But for now, thank you all for tuning in.